My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me today is Mr. Jamie Hopkins, the man behind the phenomenal handle, Retirement Risks. Jamie, introduce yourself to the audience here. Who are you? How did you get involved, interested in markets, and why exactly the focus on the advisor community?
Yeah, well, thanks, Michael, and appreciate you having me on. Yeah, a little bit of my background. I guess I'll start with what I do today and work backwards. But today I sit as a managing partner of Wealth Solutions at a firm called Carson Group, and I work with a lot of advisors and then just regular people too, out there on investing planning, retirement planning, anything that kind of falls in that financial bucket. Historically, my background was I was an attorney originally, and still am licensed, but don't practice law anymore. Got to work on some really amazing cases just for my own knowledge. I got to work on one of Bernie Madoff's cases, which brought me into this whole world of kind of the misuse of trust, where we want this investing world and personal finance world to be built on trust, and it's so important for people, but it's been abused historically in a lot of areas in this world, and that kind of brought me into this world and see how I could make an impact on it. Generally as a person, I'm a big runner. I've got 3 young children, a dog, Baxter, who's a Labradoodle, who's the cover of my phone. So love him. And my wife's an attorney also for, that's actually how we met. So kind of live in that legal world. So we have lots of negotiations inside of the household with 2 attorneys. But that's a little bit about me, and run a podcast too, and then I've written a handful of books on this space of kind of personal financial planning.
So I interact with advisors all across the country. I'm actually about to do a CFA for presentation in another state here. And I'll tell you, I'm very cynical of the advisor community. I find that a lot of financial advisors are really just good salesmen. They don't necessarily have sort of the intellectual curiosity around markets. I'd argue it's less about being a fiduciary, more about CYA, right, which means go with the sort of classic passive tactical, as opposed to tactical type approach. Why is it that you think that advisors, broadly speaking, have failed to increase that trust? I mean, it's got to go more beyond just sort of the idea of one's portfolio. There's got to be something more to that trust aspect, which has been lacking over the last several years.
Yeah, Michael, and I've written about this and stated it, so I feel fine saying it too. That cynical part that you have, I have a bit also, and I've kind of said to people, I probably would only hire about 5% of financial professionals, financial advisors that are out there today. Now, without any other context, that might seem low or high to somebody, right? Like you might be like, I'd only do 1%. So, but I grew up in the legal field, and I tell people I'd probably hire more than half the attorneys I know. It's a pretty high percentage. It's not every attorney I think is good, but it's probably more than half that I would actually hire for some aspect of something. So that's a little bit of my grounding between the two. For as much as you might dislike attorneys in the legal field, I think half of them are really good. They have that intellectual curiosity. They try to learn. They try to better themselves, and they live inside of a profession. One of the issues on the financial service, and you'll even hear me struggle with the terminology sometimes because it's, is it a service industry? Is it a professional world? And it still sits in between there. It hasn't fully professionalized. There's not a base level of knowledge that's required to call yourself an advisor or planner or any of those things. And that's deteriorated trust, in my view, to some degree. The lack of transparency on compensation has been a huge issue. But part of it is just the history of finance. If you go back in time, a lot of this developed from products first, and the notion of services and planning came later. We placed insurance policies originally, and insurance agents were the trusted financial advisor of sorts to communities. But really, they were placing captive products with commissions so they were salespeople, as you said. And this industry was built upon sales originally. Even the stock world and the investing world was compensated on sales, not performance, not outcomes, not goals, but really performance and sales. And and it's taken a while to kind of get there. Now, I think when you look back and you look at the grand scheme of everything, it's not because people are bad and that all the advisors are bad people. I think most advisors are good people, just as I look at most of the world as good people. But the systems and the incentives and the way that it was structured and the way that it's developed didn't develop in a way that instilled trust and behavior. It was compensation drives behavior to a lot of extent. And we compensated in a world around, right, sales. And so we didn't get this interest in the person's ultimate outcome. What are your goals? What are your aspirations in life? But instead, the placement of products and investments. And so that whole curiosity factor of to better understand what else is out there. Is there a better way to do this? How does this impact the other four things in the person's life? Wasn't occurring. I do believe it is getting better, but it's not getting better overnight. It's not going to be better next year. It is a slow process when systems evolve over, decades. And that's more or less where we are. I don't expect it to change overnight, but I do see that movement in this space.
It's interesting. The fees were a lot higher for advisors, 2 decades ago versus now. I mean, fee compression happened not just in the mutual fund and ETF space, but obviously on the FA space. And the end result of that was that there was less, there has been a trend towards less T&E type of spending to get clients and to make your existing clients happy, right? So whereas before, 2 decades ago, you had large fees and advisors would take a bunch of clients out to these large steak dinners. Now you don't have anywhere near that type of dynamic because there's just less money flowing around. Do you think that that dynamic, the fee compression, is directly related to some of the frustration around the advisor community because now there isn't that distraction of the entertainment aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's a great thing that it's gone, right? I really do. I don't think we need all of that to service people well and take care of people. Fee compression is real. It's going to continue. The other thing that it is causing, and this is real too, is that we have fewer advisors than we used to have, that there are less people interested in coming into this business because of that. And again, that is not necessarily a bad thing as we sit today. Could that become a problem? Absolutely. There are other industries. I look at the CPA world right now, and I'm a little bit fearful of what happens in the next 5 to 10 years there. I think the good news on the CPA world is tech has really, started to fill in some of those gaps, but people aren't coming in and being CPAs. Now, we could get that same issue here in 5 to 10 years on the financial advice and advisory world, where advisors just aren't coming in enough to replace those that are leaving the business. And look, you have to look at that and say some of that could be compensation. I do think that technology is filling in enough, even in the advisor world, where we can have fewer people working in the space, serving more clients at a more cost-efficient manner and in a better manner. And it just removes some of that other distraction stuff that, really isn't adding to somebody's ultimate long-term, happiness, their financial freedom. So I think it's a really good thing. I don't think, I was in the legal world. There was a time when the legal world had a lot more of that too. And that's kind of been cut out. I don't think that's been harmful for people's legal advice and, business outcomes. So I think as we look at that, it's okay that some of that, you almost look at that as fat in excess, has been cut out of industries and ultimately benefits the consumer.
How much of the frustration around the advisor community is also driven by the fact that, for the last decade plus or so, all you had to do is buy the S&P and close your eyes, right? I mean, I think there is just, and it's not really fair. In fairness to the advisors, it's not fair against them to say, well, you underperformed the S&P when there's no consideration for risk of the tolerance of the clients, right? All this stuff, right? But the reality is, you and I both know, everyone compares everything to the S&P, home bias, availability heuristics. How much of that frustration is just around sort of the idea that, well, why do I need an advisor when I just buy, the SPY ETF?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. I think that the notion for a long time that advisors, and this is where that terminology, are you an investment advisor? And really what you advise on is the portfolio construction, and that you had some magic way to put together a portfolio. And then all of a sudden you say, hey, it underperformed the S&P. Again, to your point, was it ever supposed to beat the S&P? A lot of portfolios are constructed not to do that because you're doing other things with it. Totally fair then. But everybody kind of compares against that. That's what's on TV. It's what people, you get updates on your phone on. I think that a challenge with what I'll just call the true advisory world, which is doing more planning, risk management, investing, is that it's been hard to demonstrate value for cost of service. And that is continuously plagued, in my view, since I've been part of this industry and profession, has plagued that trust factor, because most advisors are compensated off the investment portion because that's where the money is. It actually makes sense. I'm not super opposed to that. But then the value might be performed in tax alpha. It might be performed in planning. It might be performed in actually just your general well-being and, not having to manage this. And you are paying somebody to outsource something. That's perfectly okay, right? You can pay people to outsource something so you don't have to do it. There's lots of things I could do myself in my life that I don't do. Like I actually do know how to sew. I've built Halloween costumes and set costumes, but I don't go sew all my new clothes. And yes, maybe I could do that more efficiently or less costly, but I'm giving up other things. So I think it's always important that that's okay, but it's been hard for advisors to demonstrate that value for their cost. I think that brings back frustrations. I did some research with American College, I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, where we did survey about 1,500 Americans that had at least, I think, $500,000 investable assets. And we looked at those working with advisors. And actually, a lot of the frustration level was about not clearly understanding the advisor's compensation before engaging with them. And it actually didn't matter as much how the advisor was compensated if the clients clearly understood that beforehand. But when they didn't, the frustration level then was much higher. And to me, that gets back to the fact that advisors sometimes shy away from that because they don't know how to demonstrate their value for what they're charging people.
Right, and they don't know how to do that because you can't guarantee performance. I mean, that's at the end of the day, it's a strange dynamic actually in this industry, right? So you're providing a service that you cannot say this is going to be unequivocally your deliverable when you need that deliverable the most.
Mm-hmm. And that's a challenge. And if you hide from that, right, and you try to put that on the back burner, it actually erodes trust. What I have found is you have to be transparent about that and saying this is how we're compensated. Here's the things we're going to do for you. But to your point, I can't guarantee where the S&P is going to go. In fact, as an advisor, I really have no control over that part. Now, what we do have control over is making sure you have the right assets in the right location, that the investments based off what we know are at least tied to your outcomes. Tax loss harvesting, if that's something that you care about, we can engage in those types of things. And then you can layer on additional services. I think that's where the industry is moving now. So how do you do the tax prep for the person? You make their life easier. Can you manage their estate plan, bring in attorneys, help draft those documents, make their life easier? Can you add in things like insurance review, PNC, your homeowner stuff? And maybe you're not being directly compensated for that in the way of commissions, but you're building that into your planning. You're making a client's life easier. You're able to demonstrate that value where you're not just stuck on the performance of an investment that you don't control.
I think part of that being tied to outcomes relates to the name of the space, which is so I was going back and forth as far as what to name the space. I figured let's make it the retirement lie because it sounds a little bit dramatic, but
yeah,
I do think there is a cynicism around most people thinking that they can retire when they probably can't, given national savings rates and how much is in the bank.
Yeah.
But more so than that, the classic idea from the advisor community is simple, right? If you want to think about retirement, you go heavy in equities at the start of your life and your career. Then you go more and more towards bonds. And the problem, as we know, is that bonds have gotten utterly destroyed, right? And inflation has utterly destroyed all that. And that goes back to your trust point, right? Because it's well, you told me bonds were supposed to give me an income to give me a life that I can retire off of, and now you don't really have that after inflation. So how do advisors manage the retirement lie, the lie being that one can actually retire on a real return basis and still have the same quality of life?
Yeah, so I'm going to hop into this notion, the retirement lie. I like that. So good job on the titling for this one. There are 3 things that I look at in this that I just say we get fundamentally wrong. So one of those is actually what you brought up. And I think it was, maybe it was, Bogle at Vanguard, I think, made this kind of somewhat popular is once you get to retirement, just take 100 and subtract out your age, and there's your stock to bond portfolio. And every year, move 1%, to the bond portfolio. And it sounded really nice. I even remember John Oliver's show, the Late Night with John Oliver, or whatever it's called. And he has an episode maybe 4 or 5 years ago where they talk about this industry. And in that show, they said, hey, the one thing you need to know is to do that. And it was their statement of finance is super easy if you just pay attention to this one rule. Now, the interesting thing about that one rule that almost everybody, or rule of thumb that everybody's been taught, if you actually run it through any type of mathematical analysis, what actually happens in the market, if you do that, you actually severely underperform a steady allocation in retirement of stocks to bonds. You actually increase the risk of running out of money. Like, it's really, like, it sounds great, but it's not true. And we've accepted a lot of things to be true here because they sound about right. And that's one of them. And to me, that's been that's a retirement lie. It actually does not help you. In theory, you think, oh, I'm getting safer and safer. But actually, safety is not your total, it's not that, kind of risk to return paradigm in retirement. It's, can you provide income and a stream of income for long enough to not outlive that? And so there's research. I'm sure a lot of people here have seen these names before, but Michael Kitces and Wade Pfau published something called the Rising Equity Glide Path. And that actually shows that starting lower in the beginning of retirement and increasing your equity allocation over time actually outperforms that decreasing equity allocation through retirement, which is totally counterintuitive to what everybody's been told. But that, at least historically, is what has worked. It's just math. It's nothing else besides that. And when you actually test it, the other one didn't work well. So that one's a big lie to me. The other one is that we focus on savings and that investment return aspect. Everything everybody's been told through their whole financial life is, if you save more money than you spend, you will be fine. You can retire. You can live through retirement. That's not really accurate. And we tell people to do that for 30, 40 years. They get to retirement. And then we say, best of luck. You now need to learn how to spend money. And you're like, wait a second. You told me that all I needed to learn how to do was save money and not spend money. And now you're telling me that I have to figure out how to spend down this portfolio. That the only thing I've been told for 30 years, as long as that keeps going up and I keep saving, I'm going to be okay. And that, to me, is probably the biggest lie, and I did air quotes, that's out there about kind of retirement security. It is not about the amount of money that you learn how to save or how you learn how to save. Now, look, that is important, but when we get to retirement, we have to understand how to spend money and make it last for 30 or 40 years. It's about the income at that point. It's not about the dollar amount that you save. There's never enough if you just look at a dollar amount to save, because it's entirely dependent on how we're going to spend it, how we're going to withdraw that money, and how are we going to make it last for an unknown period of time, for an unknown amount of risk that we're going to face during a 30 or 40-year retirement. And that, if you look at the data, we have a lot of people that enter retirement and just don't spend any money. They don't spend any money because they're so fearful of running out, because they have no experience with this. They have no downside protection in that sense of running out of money. Now, Americans are very subject to Social Security. It's a huge part of the retirement income and retirement picture here in the United States. It's super important. I also push on people all the time, like, we can't see Social Security go away here. We have no backup to that today. People aren't saving enough. We have no other system. We need to find a way to support that. But it does need change now. So I'll pause there. I know that was a
actually,
I get going on that one. So
no, I love that, but I think this is worth. I think you said it correctly. It's like that old adage, right? It's not what you make; it's how much you keep, right? So, but the idea of sort of learning to spend properly is a habit, just like saving, and they're not obviously mutually exclusive. Because if you know how to spend less and be thrifty, you're going to end up saving more. Mm-hmm. But I got to be honest with you, realistically, that's a really hard thing for people to do. I mean, look. The shorter one's lifespan is, the more you're going to spend, because fuck it, you might die tomorrow, right? I mean, that's just the reality. I think a lot of what we've seen with inflation is related to that dynamic, right? It's like, why did you have the baby boom inflationary period? Because everyone was reminded about death, and they wanted to have families, and they want to spend more. COVID comes along, everyone's reminded about death, they want to spend more, they want to go on the best vacations, because who the hell knows if they're going to get COVID, and it's not going to, you're not going to be around tomorrow. So to your point, it is hard for people to think in those terms, because, and I've heard you talk about this before, most people think they're going to die younger than they probably will, which is why they end up spending more sooner rather than thinking about the very, very long term.
Yeah, and that's actually, like, to your whole point there, that's not irrational. Like, it's actually totally rational, right? If you think you're going to die in the next 10 years, you should spend all your money in the next 10 years, right? And the reality is, you are more likely to die in the next 10 years probably than you are 40 years from today. So if you were going to, if you're a gambler and you're putting your money on one of the two spaces, you would put your money on spending today instead of trying to save it for 40 years from today. That's actually not irrational. The challenge with that is the fact that, like, we live in a world where there is a high risk of us living for 30, 40 years, and that running out of money isn't something that we can easily fix when we get to that part. Kind of like when we're working, there's this notion that, like, hey, if I run out of money, I can always work longer, I can save more, I can cut back, that somehow I can fix this myself. When you're 85, there's very few levers to pull anymore to fix the problem of running out of money, right? We just run out of options or have very few options. So then we start relying on, social programs, family members. And to a lot of people, we kind of lose that dignity of, our own financial freedom and control because we become reliant on others. But it's very hard to balance those time periods. And in fact, this is a really cool piece of research that came out of UCLA back in, I think, 2011, 2012. It's this concept of your future self. And the notion is that, how we view ourselves today, we've studied brainwave activity and looked at it and say, okay, we have this picture of ourselves today. We care about ourselves. We prioritize ourselves today. Why? We're alive today, so we might as well enjoy it. Now, if we ask ourselves about our future self, and we ask ourselves about a third party on here, so I see Jake is a listener on here. If you ask me about Jake and you ask me about myself in 30 years, my brain actually reacts fairly similarly. Like, I don't know Jake, probably a nice guy. I'm not saving for Jake's retirement, though. Just like if you look at my brainwave activity about myself in 30 years, I don't know that person. I don't behave as if that person is me today. So I'm not as willing to sacrifice for them, just as I wouldn't sacrifice for Jake's future over my own future today or my own self today. So we actually have this interesting aspect that our brain, our actual body and chemistry and makeup is telling us to prioritize ourselves today. That is probably a survival technique, and it makes sense, right? If I don't pay attention to crossing the road and I get hit by a bus, doesn't matter how much money I save for my future self. I have to prioritize me today. And so that's, to me, this super interesting research. Now, they've taken that further since that original study and actually looked at, what are ways we can connect ourselves to our future self. So they call that connectedness. And as we become more connected to that future self, we see long-term behavioral changes. It's not just in the financial sense. We actually see those people who feel more connected to their future self, or their brainwave activity is closer, that they actually save more for their future self for retirement. Those people actually eat healthier, they work out more. So all these things start to change because you start caring about this person that you haven't met yet, that is your future self, and you start changing your behavior. But that's actually really hard to do. There's some visioning techniques, there's goal setting techniques. There's actually been research that shows when you show somebody an aged photo of themselves, they'll start to behave a little bit differently too, because they can envision themselves at a future age, which I find truly fascinating.
Wasn't there an app not too long ago that would do that? Right?
Yeah, Face App.
Face App, that was it. Right? I did that, and I swear to God, I looked like Santa Claus. It was the worst. It's like I do not want to look like that. So, but okay, and just for the remaining 20 minutes or so here, everybody, please make sure you follow Jamie Hopkins on Twitter, and feel free to engage. Always happy to bring people up and ask questions. I want to go back to that point about, because I've seen those studies too, that it turns out the idea that you should have more bonds later in your life is just not true based on history, that you're actually better off having more equities. The problem with that research is that would never hold in court, right? No. So, no, really. And so,
it would not.
It would not, right? And where I'm going with that is there is this other aspect of finding an advisor where it's the odds, I would argue, are stacked against the advisor in doing anything that would seemingly look aggressive, but may end up being the right thing to do for the client, because in a court of law, there's a lot of precedent around the idea that, listen, if you're an 80-year-old, the last thing you should do is have any duration in your portfolio, which means don't have stocks, don't have long duration corporate credit. And again, that may be the best thing to do, but the odds are stacked against the advisor in doing that because there's legal repercussions.
Yeah, it's hard to get there. I would say I know advisors that have gone that route, but it's pretty tough. I remember one time talking to Wade Fowle after they published that, and I had the exact same conversation. I said, for as much as I love that, if I was an advisor, I still would never do it because of the same thing. Like I'm 90% in equities for an 85-year-old, and she dies and her kids walk in and they're just like, why in the world was my mom in 85% equities? And we just happened to hit, right? Like last year and the market's down 20%. And they're saying, like, basically you cost us, 20% of our inheritance, and they're suing you. That's you really don't want to be there. Now, there actually is some software out there that, has started to take hold. There's a smaller company called Income Conductor that does rising equity glide path, like retirement projections and things like that. That's going to give you a little bit. But look, I still agree with you. I don't think you want to end up there in some type of arbitration or court proceeding trying to convince, a bunch of people that somehow you're bucking the only one of like the only 4 financial like rules of thumbs they've ever heard in their entire life. It seems like a terrible place to be. But that's not, that's not uncommon for the advisory world, right? We have preconceived notions or rules of thumb that are, sound good, but aren't really great. I'll use another example here. This one's pretty niche area, but it was one that I was involved with back in like 2012 with FINRA and an organization that I used to take part of, which was around reverse mortgages. And so most people have a negative view of reverse mortgages. It's a product, then there's a bunch of reasons why. And there was some deceptive marketing and things that occurred at one point that has been cleaned up a little bit. But FINRA used to have an investor alert that said, like, basically talk to your trusted financial advisor, but only use reverse mortgages as a line of last resort. Well, again, when you ran the math around reverse mortgages and how to use home equity as part of retirement, you actually found out that like using it as the very last asset was the single worst way to use it. Like it was awful. Like it underperformed every other way to use home equity. And it took like a decade of research and then say, hey, look, like you shouldn't have this in here because in fact, you should use home equity more dynamically. You should use it earlier in retirement to offset other risks. You shouldn't hold it as a line of last resort because it means all your other assets are depleted. You didn't use it strategically. And they eventually changed that. But I mean, it took a decade of work. And my assumption is most investors still view it that way because that's what they were told for 20 years, right? By the people who were, supposed to be watching out for them. But there was no research around it. It was just presumed to be, well, it's kind of a product that seems risky, so use it at the end if you use it at all. And it kind of set everybody on this notion of thinking about that in the absolute wrong way. But I think for advisors, that's been a challenge. Like it's changed a little bit. Advisors have started to use home equity differently over the last 10 years. But, you still have that perception issue. And I still think you could run into challenges there in a court type proceeding if it ever happened or an arbitration. It's a lot of work to overcome that.
No, and actually that's an important point of sort of the unintended consequences of regulators trying to protect investors. They end up having the wrong framework themselves, and that ends up hurting the very investors they're trying to protect from a longer term perspective.
Yeah, there was a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau article one time about Social Security, and they did an analysis on it. And I remember, I started reading it. I wrote an article in the Forbes or New York Times about it, kind of trashing it because, in it, it was like, well, we ignored the fact that Social Security has inflation protection. And I was like, so this analysis is totally useless. And it had this whole outcome on how people should behave. And it was like, but potentially the cost of living adjustment to Social Security is the single most expensive and beneficial part of Social Security. So to ignore that, you literally ignored half of the economics of the program. And it's kind of so any statement that you made as analysis of this, is kind of thrown out the window. But that's one of those things that always kind of bothers me because people do rely on that. They read that and say, hey, this is coming from a trusted source. And it's not like they were trying to be harmful. But to me, that was a super good example of they just shouldn't put that out, right? There's no benefit to do that if you're doing, and that you're right. In that case, you probably knew that your analysis was fundamentally flawed. There shouldn't be an article about it. Either fix it or do nothing. And that was kind of my stance around that one. I don't mind you doing this, but if you're going to do it, at least attempt to do it right. Going back to our earlier conversation, that actually erodes trust in everybody in finance, right? It erodes trust in the regulators. It erodes trust in advisors because if they recommend something different that might actually be mathematically more correct, then you're saying, hey, this regulator and consumer watchdog said something else. And you're like, well, they didn't adjust for any cost of living adjustments. So they're just talking about a fixed payment stream from Social Security, which does not exist. So it has nothing to do with reality.
The truth is a lot of this would get solved if you had a national mandate around home economics and understanding investing and spending and financial planning when you're a kid. I mean, I think there's a lot of misinformation and confusion because it's not taught at a very basic standardized level for the youth.
Yeah, and I see one of my friends on here, Anna, and she's involved with a financial literacy program and that also adapts running for young children too. So Mini Money Runners, and she works a little bit with that in Denver. But that whole literacy side of this is super important. I will say literacy alone is not enough, but it is important. We don't mandate that. We don't teach it. It does have to occur in the household too. And I think that probably then takes 2 generations, that we can't expect to teach one group that and say, hey, all the behavior is going to change. But if we teach one generation that, then they will teach their children the same thing. And it probably does take 2 generations to fully change that if we made that decision today. There's been some good movement at the state level of requiring some education out there, which I'm happy to see. But it's, the sad part about that is, we might not fully see that impact during our life, even if we get it done today. I make this comment, I've been a professor for, I guess, 12 years now. And, 2 different universities. And one thing I always tell people, though, is education without execution is just smarter people doing the same dumb things. So we also need to be able to take that stuff and execute on things. And that means we also need to be able to give people fair wages so they can save. A lot of people just don't make enough money in this country to save enough. They start out behind, they remain behind. And no matter what you learn from a financial literacy standpoint, it's not going to change that. You need the opportunity to earn. I do think we have great opportunities here in our country. And I'm super just grateful for my opportunities. So I don't want to pretend like I'm not there. I've had great opportunities, but it's not enough, right? We know lots of people struggle. We know that there's not enough opportunity for everybody. And that's going to hold people back, even if they become financially literate. So unless we kind of get to that standpoint where, everybody has an opportunity, everybody can't move forward.
Let's talk about your book for a bit here. Find Your Freedom, Financial Planning for a Life on Purpose. Financial Planning for a Life on Purpose is a good subtitle because the key word there, I think, term is on purpose. Mm-hmm. Right? How do you actually plan for the idea that you will be in your 90s and live that long? First of all, just talk to the audience the process of writing the book, why you want to write it with Ron Carson, and what are some of the major themes that you're outlining in?
Yeah, well, that book, Find Your Freedom, is pretty much available everywhere. We hit Wall Street Journal bestseller back in November, so it's been a fun ride getting the book out there. And so the process of writing a book, I think, however you want to define this, it's either my second book or my 8th book. I have 2 ebooks I wrote for Forbes. I have another book called Rewirement that I wrote about retirement income planning, and then I wrote 3 textbooks. So I've written a couple different things, but this was probably the first one I really put my own story into. So I talk about my childhood and growing up and my experiences with money, my first money memories. And it's a little bit more personal than some of the other things that I've written. And funny enough, the first version of this, I wrote about half of a book and scrapped the whole thing. I just started reading and it felt like a textbook. And I was like, this is super boring. And I scrapped the whole thing. It's super painful. It's kind of like a big sunk cost. And I was just like, it's just not good. So I re-outlined it and then restarted writing it and had a great team around me that, helped edit it and get it to the publisher and all those fun things. So that it was a good process ultimately. And I think I started writing it in November of last year and it got published in November of this year. So from start to all the way finish out the door into bookstores was 1 full year. A lot of that is the editing process. The book takes a little bit of a different approach. I started writing it like a financial planning textbook. Here's charts, here's graphs, here's what you need to do. I eventually scrapped that, and the whole first half of the book is about kind of defining your life. So that life on purpose, live life by design, not by default. And it's about setting your own goals and then getting past those to your aspirations. That's kind of a theme in the front end too, is how do we get past goals to aspirations? And what I mean by that is do you want to be a great father? Well, that's your aspiration, right? I want to be a great father. I've got 3 kids. I want to be a good example. Now, I've got goals along the way, right? I want to work hard. I want to be a good husband. I want to save for their future. But those are goals. And ultimately, those goals are important to show that I'm making progress, but they're not the ultimate aspiration and outcome. But I think often we get kind of sucked into the goals and we lose sight of the bigger picture. Can I still be a great father without achieving any of those goals? Probably. They just have to be different goals. And so it's a little bit of that in the front end. It's, getting that relationship that you have with money, exploring that, going back to some of those early memories, talking about those experiences, and then setting out that framework of the life that you want to live. We even do things in that, like we have a section where we challenge you to write your eulogy, which is a super powerful thing. Like, how would your friends write your eulogy today? How do you want it to be written? What are the core values that you want your family or friends to know about you, or you pass along to your children? So the whole first half of the book is that. Second half is really what you should expect from a financial planning process that can help get you there. Now, that's kind of like the base part, right? Like, financial planning alone doesn't get you to finding your freedom. But if we don't have that security in our finances, we won't find our freedom. We won't get to those aspirations. We'll always be struggling with, where's our next meal coming from? How am I going to pay this bill? And we get sucked into that. It's very much the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what I believe core is that financial planning helps take that off so we can move up that ladder to self-enlightenment, fulfillment, and ultimately finding what freedom means to us.
How does one go about that process of financial planning without a financial planner? So, again, talking from the standpoint of advisor, they're a financial planner, right? Advisor's more asset allocation. How do you manage the risk and volatility? But financial planning is a whole different dynamic, and I think people confuse the two.
Yeah, so they are two different things, right? I would actually argue financial planning and the CFP credential and some of the other ones has gotten closer to a profession, where the advice arena is still a service industry. And there are different things. Now, the reality is everybody does not need, and I say this in the book, even though I work for a company that does this, everybody does not need their own financial planner or advisor. You can do this yourself. It's okay to be empowered to do it yourself. In fact, that's like half of the point of writing the book, is to say, look, here's what you need to think about from a process standpoint. And it is based off your goals and aspirations. And then you work on those areas. And there are strategies and things to get you there. But if you love it, you have the time, you have the ability and the resources, you can do it yourself. Now, if you don't have the time, you don't enjoy it, then you might want to delegate that to somebody else. And then you have to find somebody that fits your philosophy, that is transparent, that, what we started talking about here, has that intellectual curiosity to constantly be learning and improving. Because planning is not a stagnant thing. It is not a 80-page binder that somebody puts on your desk. It is the process of planning that is important. And there's all those different quotes, right? A plan's useless, but planning is essential type of things. And that is true, because our life is so dynamic. It changes so rapidly. We can't rely on some document that was put in front of us before. But what that helps us do is, one, envision the path that we want to go on. It sets mile markers along the way, and it does drive action. And I think that's that action and execution that I was talking about before. One of the challenges I see with a lot of people that quote unquote like do it yourself is they get stuck in inaction, that they know that there are things they need to do. I actually saw this a lot when I was an attorney doing some estate planning work, is people are like, oh, I knew I needed to update my will or this or that. And they only come in once something bad has occurred, that the inertia kept in until something moved them. A family member died, they had a heart attack, they got sick, they didn't come in. Then all of a sudden they wanted long-term care, they wanted life insurance, they wanted something in place, and you couldn't get it anymore because they got stuck in inaction. And so one thing that outsourcing to somebody can help with is the fact of unmoving you even when you don't feel like being moved. So I think that's a super valuable part. But look, you have to set a process. So are you going to review your finances, your debt, your cash flow? Are you going to set future goals? Are you going to review your risk? Are you going to think about home equity? Are you going to do all those things and put them together in a picture? That can be challenging for people. Tax laws, estate laws change. So maybe you need a CPA to come in and help you with your plan, or you need an attorney. But figuring out who are the right people that you surround yourself, that you trust to build out that plan, is crucial. Almost everybody's going to need some help along the way, to my point of like, is it a healthcare professional? Is it an attorney? Is it a CPA? Is it a financial advisor? Is it a financial planner? You don't need all of them. You can do it yourself. You need to have some guidance to it. You got to care about it. You got to want to do it, have the time and resources to be able to do it also. Sorry, Michael, I might have.
Sorry. Yeah, that's my fault. No, I think it's important to know that this is more than just, it's important for more than just sort of, upper middle class or upper class, right? I mean, the financial planning should be at the forefront of those who don't have much money, those who are trying to get more money. I mean, it should be something for everybody.
Yeah, and I this is my why story, and I'll do this real quick. I think everybody needs to feel worthy of financial advice and planning. Everybody needs to know it's available to them. The market hasn't served everybody yet. My parents, neither one of them graduated college. My dad did construction. My mom worked with him. They ran their own company. They were entrepreneurs, set out, right, to build a better life for them and their kids. My dad passed away when I was 8 years old on a construction site. Essentially, it started raining. Aluminum ladder froze over faster than the roof, was coming down, slipped, fell, broke his neck, and passed away that day. And so I lived in a world where, construction workers, non-college graduate construction workers do not get a lot of financial advice and planning out there in the world. And it left our family in exactly that same spot of, a family without the planning they need, without the right life insurance, without the right estate planning, without that right plan to protect, right, the family in case of this type of tragedy. And what I want to see in this world, and as part of why I work in this profession, it's why I'm at a place like Carson, is I want to democratize advice. I want to give out free resources. I want to have a business that also offers that type of planning and advice. And then eventually, and it's not going to happen overnight, but allow it so, everybody like my mom feels worthy of advice, which she does not, right? She doesn't trust this industry. She doesn't trust this profession. She knows that they weren't there for her when she was younger. And, she doesn't have that trust factor. And that's my driver. It's like, how do we get to the next person like my mom isn't in the same spot because they felt that they could get advice, they felt they could get planning, or if not, they had those resources out there, like a book, like websites, like articles and PDFs, like, free technology that's growing, that they could get at least the basics to be okay.
How do people find you and reach out to you, Jamie, other than through Twitter?
Yeah, so on Twitter, I'm at Retirement Risks. My website's jamiehopkins.com. Our company, carsongroup.com. You can always reach out there. There's forums. I do a lot of speaking. But those are the main ways. The book is available. I mean, most people buy stuff on Amazon today. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, everything like that. And Michael, I really appreciate you for bringing me on here today and let me talk a little bit about my story and history.
Yeah, no, definitely. And again, everybody, please make sure you follow Jamie here on Twitter. I'm going to wrap this up a little bit early, only because I'm trying to multitask, and I'm about to head over to do a CFA chat presentation, which I will also have live on Twitter Spaces in about an hour. Thank you, Jamie. Really do appreciate it. We'll be in touch.
Yep. Thank you. See you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Cheers.